Tonight, dozens of Watertown residents are without water. You could see water just going through the streets as you were around the scene. City officials saying aging infrastructure the likely culprit for a water main break at the intersection of Franklin and South Pleasant Street. According to city engineer Thomas Campo, no boil water advisory is in effect, but roughly 50 homes along Franklin Street are completely without water. At this point, the city has managed to isolate and stop that leak. Now workers are waiting for authorization to dig at the site to find out the extent of the damage. 7 News spoke with one resident who says the break flooded his basement.
The basement flooded. They said it was like 2 or 3 inches of water down there, or a little bit more. So it took a while to get it all drained out of there, but it's finally done. Now we got to wait for National Grid to come over so they can do an inspection down there to make sure everything's okay.
And according to the city engineer, workers will remain on site until that break is repaired.